you are paying a tax on your own fear. You feel it every time you glance at a headline about a once-in-a-generation tech breakthrough or a digital asset promising to rewrite the laws of physics. In 2026, the pressure to get in early is not just an investment strategy. It is a survival instinct. You are told that if you do not buy a piece of the future today, you will be a servant to it tomorrow. That low thrumming anxiety, that fear of missing out, is the most profitable product ever sold. But here is the secret the architects of the market do not want you to know. Your anxiety was blueprinted nearly 2 centuries ago. Long before the internet, before the ticker tape, and before the silicon chip, there was the iron. In the mid-1840s, the British middle class was not looking at screens. They were looking at maps. Lines of ink across the countryside represented thousands of miles of proposed railway track. They were sold the exact same vaporware you are sold today. Geography is dead. Speed is the only currency. This time, it is different. Now, let us open the case file on the Railway Mania and reveal the shadow behind the success. The year is 1845, but the psychological landscape is a perfect mirror image of your own. For decades, the English public had played it entirely safe. They parked their life savings in consoles, government bonds that paid a steady, remarkably boring 3%. It was the financial equivalent of a nap. But then, the Industrial Revolution hit its absolute stride. Suddenly, the entire world was shrinking rapidly. A grueling journey that once took days by horse now took a matter of hours by steam. It was not just a machine. It was a literal miracle of the modern age. The government, led by Prime Minister Robert Peel, clearly saw the boundless potential. In 1844, they passed the Railway Act. This was a sweeping piece of legislation intended to tightly regulate the chaos, but which instead acted as a starting pistol for a massive regulatory arbitrage. It signaled to every shopkeeper, every clergyman, and every widow that the Iron Road was officially sanctioned by the Crown. It carried the ultimate fiduciary illusion. It was considered entirely safe. This is exactly where the trap was set. Capitalists like George Hudson, a former linen draper turned railway king, realized a very dark truth. You did not actually need to build a functioning railway to get unbelievably rich. You just needed to sell the compelling idea of one. Hudson did not trade in coal, steel, and steam. He traded in momentum and dreams. He understood a fundamental Wall Street reality long before Wall Street existed. If you give people a choice between a 3% bond and a 10% dividend on a guaranteed railway line, they will choose the dream every single time. By 1845, the entire country was gripped by a collective fever. This was not just the wealthy elite playing recklessly with their surplus gold. This was the violent birth of the retail investor. The ultimate bag holders. People were actively withdrawing their life savings, selling cherished family heirlooms, and heavily mortgaging their futures to buy scrip. Scrip was a piece of paper, a physical, heavy document with an ornate border that merely gave you the right to buy shares in a proposed railway line. But here is the forensic reality of the era. Of the 800 massive schemes proposed during the peak of the mania, the vast majority existed only on paper. The Railway King was not just expanding the national network. He was running a symphonic Ponzi scheme. He would utilize the fresh capital from new investors to pay attractive dividends to old ones. It was a primitive pump and dump, meticulously wrapped in the prestige of the industrial age. He was cooking the books before the phrase even existed in the English language, actively manipulating the accounts of the Midland Railway to show staggering profits that were nothing more than ink and raw imagination. You see, the railway was not a transport system. It was a vacuum. It was systematically designed to suck the capital out of the Victorian drawing room and directly into the pockets of slick promoters who fully knew that the tracks they were promising could never realistically be built. The actual geography of England simply could not support 9,000 miles of new track in 3 short years. But when the engine of greed is running at full steam, nobody bothers to look at the map. They only look at the price of the ticket. To understand exactly how they liquidated your ancestors' wealth, you have to dissect the intricate machine they built to do it. It was not constructed of iron pistons and steam valves. It was built on paper and legislative loopholes. In the mid-1840s, the true engine of wealth generation was not the locomotive. It was the scrip. If you have ever traded a pre-market asset, a crypto derivative, or a highly leveraged meme stock, you have directly touched the ghost of 1,845. The mechanism was elegant, deeply predatory, and perfectly, legally sanctioned. It relied entirely on a 3-step cycle of theft that effectively turned the British Parliament into a high-stakes, unregulated casino. Step 1. The prospectus. Let us clearly set the scene. London, autumn 1845. A damp printer's shop just off Fleet Street smells heavily of ink and hot metal. On the wooden table lies a detailed map of England, but the railway lines have not actually been built yet. A promoter, let us call him a stag, dips his pen into the inkwell and draws them anyway. Direct London and Exeter, he confidently writes. There is no geographical survey. There is no official engineer's report. There is just ink. By morning, 5,000 copies of that glossy prospectus will be securely in the hands of eager investors. And every single one of them firmly believe the train already exists. Step 2. The deposit. This was the fatal hook. Under the strict standing orders of Parliament, a railway company could not even be considered for a legislative bill until they had successfully collected a deposit of 10% of their total estimated capital from early investors. If the massive project was estimated at £1 million, more than enough to buy 100 of the finest, sprawling mansions in London, the slick promoters only needed to find enough gullible people to cough up £100,000. For a simple shopkeeper working in Leeds, this meant you did not actually need to buy a whole share for £100. You just needed to pay a relatively tiny £2 deposit to get your desperate hands on the scrip. Step 3. The secondary market. This is where the physics of the real world vanished completely into thin air. Once you held that piece of paper, that valuable scrip, you did not wait around for the physical train to be built. You immediately sold the paper to the very next person in line for £4.
Give it to me.
You just effortlessly doubled your money without a single shovelful of dirt ever being moved. It was the greater fool theory in pure, uncut form. By 1845, there were well over 1,100 of these phantom paper railways aggressively seeking parliamentary approval. The total capital required for these ridiculous schemes reached a staggering £600 million. To clearly put that massive number in perspective, the entire national debt of Great Britain at the exact same time, the massive debt accrued from decades of fighting the brutal Napoleonic Wars, was only £800 million. The speculative market was actively asking the general public to fully fund a vanity project, nearly as expensive as the very survival of the British Empire itself. It was an absolute mathematical impossibility. Now, let us carefully examine the forensic evidence. Let us open the private ledger of the railway king himself, George Hudson. Hudson was not just a simple promoter. He was a supreme master of capital to dividend alchemy. In a functional, healthy business, you pay dividends to your shareholders out of the actual profits you make from your provided service. But Hudson's rapidly expanding railways were bleeding cash. Picture this defining moment. One evening in York, Hudson sits at a long mahogany table surrounded by his nervous accountants. The railway profits are simply not there. The financial numbers do not work. So Hudson coldly proposes a solution that will instantly make him a dark legend. He tells them to pay the massive dividend anyway. A heavy silence falls in the room. One accountant quietly whispers, "With what money?" Hudson smiles. "The new investor's money." Look closely at the 1,845 accounts of the Eastern Counties Railway. Hudson publicly recorded a handsome profit of £115,000. But a cold, clinical audit later reveals that he had actually spent over £200,000 on critical maintenance and preliminary expenses. He simply refused to subtract them from the reported earnings. He quietly moved the massive debt to a suspense account, a dark, hidden corner of the ledger where massive losses go to die. By making the failing company look wildly profitable on paper, he kept the scrip prices soaring artificially high. This allowed him to quietly dump his own shares at the absolute peak, right before the entire world realized the engine had absolutely no fuel. The victim's lens here is completely vital. You see, the innocent people buying this scrip were not Wall Street insiders or market manipulators. They were the little chaps. The official 1,845 share registers show real names like Mary Smith, Governess, and John Thompson, Taylor. These hardworking people were not buying iron and steel. They were desperately buying an escape from the crushing gravity of the rigid Victorian class system. But while the poor tailors and governesses were happily counting their fictional paper wealth, the stags were playing an entirely different game. They were shorting the iron. They fully knew that a phantom railway like the Direct London and Exeter had recklessly issued 300,000 shares for a project requiring only 120,000. They were heavily over-allocating, selling vastly more of the dream than reality could ever possibly hold. The physical manifestation of this greed was a total frenzy. The Board of Trade in London quickly became an active war zone. On the final deadline day for submitting railway bills, November 30, 1845, the grand hallways were completely clogged. Desperate promoters literally sprinted to hand in their completely fake maps before the heavy clock struck midnight. Some hired special express trains to wildly race across the country. Others desperately tried to bribe the government clerks to purposely miss the ticking clock. They were not racing to build public transport. They were racing to legalize a massive heist. They fully knew that once Parliament stamped that official bill, the small deposit legally became capital. The greedy promoters could then instantly pay themselves massive management fees that would utterly drain the bank accounts long before a single iron rail was ever laid. Before we watch the Bank of England ignite the devastating crash of 1847, pull out your phone. Look closely at your modern portfolio. In 2021, American investors poured billions into shell companies that had absolutely no profits, no viable products, and sometimes zero employees. They were called SPACs. In 1845, they simply had a different name. They were called railways. The system was meticulously designed to fail, but it was perfectly designed to make the right people incredibly rich during the rapid collapse. You are the direct descendant of the people who stood nervously in those hallways. You are the one who is constantly told that the new economy does not follow the old rules of math. But as George Hudson fully knew, and as you are about to painfully find out, financial gravity always wins. In October 1847, the music did not just cleanly stop. The entire ballroom violently collapsed. The horrific crash of the Railway Mania was not a sudden, cinematic explosion of steam and steel. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation of the entire British economy. It began with a surprisingly cold, clinical decision made by the Bank of England. Faced with a rapidly dwindling gold reserve and a failing national harvest, the bank sharply raised interest rates to 8%. It was a brutal punishment rate, specifically designed to suck all remaining liquidity directly out of the frothy market. For the vulnerable little chaps who faithfully held scrip, this was the absolute end of the world. Remember, they had not actually paid for their expensive shares in full. They had only paid the tiny initial deposit. Now, the merciless calls began. A call was a strict legal demand for the next massive installment of the share price, often demanding £5 or £10 per single share. To a struggling governess or a lowly clerk, this was vastly more than a full month's wages. And the relentless calls kept coming. Month after grueling month, exactly like a ghost, continuously knocking on the door to collect a heavy debt for a ghost train. The terrifying forensic reality of 1847 was a massive ledger of absolute ruin. By the time the British government was urgently forced to suspend the Bank Charter Act on October 25, 1847, just to logically prevent a total banking collapse, the severe damage was terminal. The disgraced railway king, George Hudson, was publicly exposed not as a financial genius, but as a spectacularly common fraudster. When the messy accounts of the York, Newcastle, and Berwick Railway were finally officially audited in 1849, the ugly truth came out. Hudson had been heavily embezzling funds and faking massive dividends on a scale that would easily make a modern Wall Street hedge fund manager blush. He immediately fled the country in disgrace to perfectly avoid a dark debtor's prison, tragically leaving behind a massive crater of capital flight and thousands upon thousands of utterly broken families. We are ultimately left with the Iron Ghost. Yes, Britain eventually got its massive railway network. It is a skeletal, functional system of tracks that deeply defines the entire country even today. But it was entirely built on the smoldering wreckage of the middle class. We are constantly told that creative destruction is the necessary price of glorious progress. But the brutal destruction was never shared equally. The wealthy promoters securely kept their sprawling mansions. The unfortunate victims only kept the heavy debt. Look closely at your own world in 2026. You are currently living through a massive digital railway mania. Every single day, a shiny new platform or a highly disruptive technology is aggressively pitched to you as the next Iron Road. They expertly use the exact same deceptive language of sheer inevitability. They aggressively demand your deposits in the modern form of your personal data, your daily attention, and your fragile retirement funds. And just like in 1845, the wealthy people selling the dream do not actually care if the train ever leaves the station, just as long as they can quickly sell the worthless scrip to the very next desperate believer. The complex lines on the map have certainly changed, but the exact geometry of the heist remains utterly identical. We still foolishly build expensive tracks to absolute nowhere, heavily fueled by the sheer delusion that we can somehow outrun the math. We are still the unfortunate little chaps, standing nervously on the platform, desperately waiting for a grand miracle that was never even scheduled to arrive. Think carefully about the very last can't-miss investment you were aggressively offered. Was it truly a viable tool for the future? Or was it just a piece of paper perfectly designed to transfer your hard-earned wealth to someone who already has far too much? How many imaginary miles are you currently paying for? History is not a clean, straight line. It is a massive, recurring loop. And right now, the dangerous engine is rapidly picking up speed. The true story of the Railway Mania is not actually about trains. It is about the eternal vulnerability of the human heart to the false promise of a shortcut. We desperately want to believe that the ironclad rules of the past do not apply to us. We blindly want to believe we are the chosen ones who finally found the secret exit. But the unforgiving market clearly knows better. The exit is always a mirage. Here is the uncomfortable million-dollar question to leave you with. Was George Hudson actually a vile criminal? Or was he simply the world's very first modern venture capitalist? If actively paying old investors with new investors' money is legally considered fraud, then half of Silicon Valley's early growth stories start looking very familiar. Because in the heavy ledger of history, every single debt must eventually be paid.